I was working a kind of a dead end job and thinking about taking classes and doing this stuff. And there was a comic shop no longer there called More Fun Comics. And it was across the street from the place I was working. And I just started going over there and hanging out. And I got a job there. And so I quit the other place and started working in a comic book store,
As
Um,
most of us do at some point,
and it,
right?
and as you know, I don't know if you can swear on this, but it was
Yeah,
the f***ing best. I mean, it really
it
was.
really was.
It really was.
That
Now,
first job working in a comic shop, man, it's like
yeah,
getting the candy store time.
I'd
It just,
had I'd had other jobs, but this was one. The second best was when I worked in a video store. When I was
oh,
16. That was a great job.
hi, it's Adam Freeman. This is Comic Industry Insiders, a weekly chat with the people behind the scenes of the comic book industry where we scratch at the surface of their careers to dig out those insights for your business or career in comics. Today, we sit down with Joe Rybandt, one of the longest serving publishing executives in comics, a man who has seen firsthand how the industry has changed, fractured, and reinvented itself over the last 3 decades. From his time at Gemstone to his leadership at Dynamite Entertainment, Joe has helped guide some of the most recognizable properties in comics while navigating the behind-the-scenes battles that shape what makes it to the shelf. In this conversation, we dig into some tough topics. The collapse of the Diamond Monopoly. Wow. See, I can't even say Diamond Monopoly anymore. And what it really meant for publishers big and small. The struggles of licensing versus original content, the delicate balance between retailers and publishers, and how the definition of success in comics has shifted over time. Joe doesn't shy away from the hard questions, and that's something we respect around here. If you've ever wanted an unfiltered look at the challenges of publishing, the realities of the direct market, and what industry veterans really think about the state of comics today, you're not going to want to miss this one. I want to say personally, thank you, Joe, for taking the time with us. It was a true pleasure. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Rybandt.
Thank you for having me. I don't do a lot of these, and I was thinking about it obviously over the last couple of days, making sure I had enough material in my head to at least be able to be conversant and
Yeah.
make this somewhat entertaining. I don't get asked, and it was nice to hear you say influential, because yeah, we've been doing this. We're in our 21st year as a publisher. I have been there since the beginning. I've actually been with the company. This year will be 24 years. It's the longest I've worked anywhere in my life. I have a child that is that same age. So, you know,
Wow.
it's been a long, interesting road, and we've known each other for a long time. And
That's right.
I'm really was really pleased that you asked, because like I said, I do not get asked to do these a lot. I don't know if it's that you slipped in that grumpily from across the room, and maybe that's the general. And you know what? They're not wrong. But
Well, you have a
and
vibe, you
and
have a real, I mean, it's not, don't get me wrong. It's
I'm
a no
smiling on the
nonsense vibe.
inside. I'm smiling on the inside.
That's right.
Um,
Staring
and I
daggers into you while smiling on the inside.
and I think I don't get asked because I think in general I would say no, to a lot. I'm not a forward facing, we're not really a forward facing company in a lot of ways. Nick obviously is. He's a
Right.
very big personality, and he is the front and center. And I've always just kind of been there, and I'm happy to speak. I've done a lot of do a lot of public stuff. Did our panels in San Diego and do all that kind of stuff. But this kind of stuff I don't really get asked. And like I said, more often than not, I most likely would say no. But it's always nice to be asked.
Well, of course. So whoever else is listening out there, be sure to ask just so he can say no. Because
Yes.
it's really, at the end of the day, it's for him. It's funny you bring that up. You mentioned Nick Barucci. A lot of us call him Nicky in the industry. Like you know exactly who you're talking about. He is a fascinating character who I'm hoping to have on the show at some point. Can you tell me, like, what is it about Nick Barucci that is the engine that made Dynamite what it is?
Wow. Well, I think in the early days, it was his drive. He often says he didn't want to be a publisher, and I think he believes that, and maybe has come around to believe that after saying it a bunch. The whole thing where you say it enough, it becomes true.
Yeah.
But it was our relationships, his relationships, that built the company. And I think I've told this story recently, but I started working at the company when it was Dynamic Forces, and it
Right.
still technically is Dynamic Forces. But and I was brought in because I had come from an internet e-commerce background, and I was brought in to help with the online efforts of the company and also marketing efforts. And at the time, the company was producing a lot of merchandise. Signed comics were a thing. They've always been. That was the thing that
Right.
Nick started with. But the company was also producing statues, and I think there were posters. There was all sorts of stuff. Trading cards, all sorts of stuff. Everything but comics, except for signed comics. And it was, and again, it goes back a ways, so I don't remember the exact particulars. But I believe in one of our licenses, and I think it was with MGM for Army of Darkness. There was, or it got added, or something happened to allow us to do comics. And I don't know that anybody really ever thought, and maybe they did, maybe I just wasn't in those meetings, but all of a sudden it became like, about 21 years ago, hey, we're doing comics now. This is another thing that we're doing. We're going to do comics.
Right.
We're going to do Army of Darkness comics. And I remember thinking, I didn't really have any idea how you do comics, but I was also thinking it probably isn't super complicated. I mean, it's complicated now, but at the time, with a little bit of youth on my side, thinking it wasn't super complicated.
How hard can it be?
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but it was the relationships that brought in, the people that did covers on our first series, the writers that we worked with, and then that evolved into Red Sonja, and that was the relationship with people like Alex Ross and John Cassaday, rest in peace.
Yeah.
And Nick really maximizing, and when I say relationship, that sounds very, very, very antiseptic. They were personal relationships, they were friendships. Um, and I think that at the time we were just in the right place at the right time to be offering a lot of creative people a chance to work on things that they had never worked on. You know, for a lot of people starting in comics, and I've always wanted to do Spider-Man, I've always wanted to do Superman, but there's some people that are like, well, you know what, I love Army of Darkness, or I love Red Sonja, or I love James Bond, whatever it is.
Right.
Um, and maximizing those friendships, those relationships, to apply that level of talent as an independent publisher to the covers, and put those big names, those big splashy names on all those multitudes of covers that we did. Um, it really, I think, set us apart in those early days because there was a lot of companies doing the kind of the same thing in terms of mining nostalgia. And here we are again, 21 years later, where nostalgia is
It's
being mined once again with a lot of the same properties.
It's the king right now. I mean, when you look at our sales charts that we're putting together, nostalgia seems to be the engine that's running the whole business right now, and you guys have always been ahead of that. I find that fascinating. And I think in many ways your company was so far ahead. We talked about covers being a thing. I want to get into that a little bit later, but specifically, like you were from reading from behind the scenes. For me, you could see how you were doing extra series that would come out at the same time in order to, I think, to get a license. I don't know. Maybe you can help me with this. I'm thinking back to when Green Hornet was out, and there was
Oh,
the
sure.
Seth Rogen book, and we had,
Uh-huh.
I think it was like 4 or 5 series all hit at once.
Yeah.
And when I poked around, it was because, look, you have to sell a certain number of copies in order to do it. Now, if it was today, you would have just put 20 more covers on it. But
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Green Hornet because I've used this recently as an example, as a humorous take to say, hey kids, at one point we were able to do 3 Green Hornet series concurrently.
that's true.
Um, there was something in the air around the time of that movie, and of course that movie didn't go, I think, where everyone that was involved wanted it to go, but
Right.
we had all of the rights for the Green Hornet. For those that don't know, licensing can be split up in a multitude of different ways. You can have licensing for a movie and then licensing for classic. Two companies can have competing licenses in that sense, but we had all the licenses. And it was the fact that Kevin Smith had an unproduced screenplay for that movie that kicked off us doing a Green Hornet series, and then bringing in Matt Wagner to do a Golden Age Green Hornet series, and then bringing in Brett Matthews to do a future Green Hornet series. Like I said, 3 Green Hornet series. I mean, it's looking back, it's insane. And then spinoffs,
Yeah.
So it wasn't a question so much of, the rights holders saying you need to do all this stuff. The market took it all,
Really? Okay.
and it didn't take it all forever, obviously.
Yeah.
But at the time it took it all. And, I will say those were all, excellent. I mean, Matt Wagner, Brett Matthews, and Phil Hester adapting Kevin Smith's screenplay. I mean, that's a triumvirate of greatness.
How do you say no to that, right? You definitely want that book. I want to go back and reread that book now that you pitch
It's good
it.
stuff. I think it holds up. It's good superhero stuff,
I imagine so. Well, all right. So I wanted to get started. If you don't mind, I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about some early roles that kind of set you up for this 24-year relationship that you've had. The little bit of digging I've done says that you started off at Gemstone. Is that right? And how did you end up with there?
Well, that was my first quote unquote real job. I before that, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up outside of Chicago in a small town called Wheaton, Illinois. Was very fortunate to have a comic shop for a while, and of course the classic spinner rack situation,
Right.
With comics. Comics since the 4th grade have always been a thing for me. And it was through just kind of drifting through my mid to late teens that I found, I was working a kind of a dead end job and thinking about taking classes and doing this stuff. And there was a comic shop no longer there called More Fun Comics. And it was across the street from the place I was working. And I just started going over there and hanging out. And I got a job there. And so I quit the other place and started working in a comic book store,
As most of us do at some point.
And,
Right?
and as you know, I don't know if you can swear on this, but it was the fucking best. I mean, it really was.
It was.
It really was.
That first job working in a comic shop, man, it's like getting a candy store time.
I'd had other jobs, but this was one. The second best was when I worked in a video store. When I was 16, that was a great job. But again, my stakes were different because I didn't own the place. So the guy. And I'm still in touch with him. I actually did a thing on Substack several years back about my experiences there as kind of a tribute to this guy because he was really the start of all of it. And at one point we had 4 stores. We were a small chain, not as big as Graham Crackers, who was the Graham Crackers actually ended up later on absorbing the More Fun chain. And a guy that I worked with back in those days, Sean Spurlock, he still works. He works for Graham Crackers. He runs their store in Madison. My best friend. So I still keep in touch with him, and I know Jamie and John and all those guys. Anyway, but working in a comic book store in your late teens, early 20s, taking classes, not really having a tremendous amount of direction in life, except for the day-to-day and the joys of working in a comic book store. I met a girl. She lived on the East Coast. I was actually traveling for the store to the Diamond Summit back in the day in Baltimore. She worked at the hotel, met her, and moved to the East Coast. And we're still married, and that's where our 2 kids come from. So, but long way around to saying, when I moved to the East Coast, I had literally, no job prospects. I was, but you don't really think about those things when you're 21 years old, right?
Right.
And fortuitously, my girlfriend at the time gave me a copy of Baltimore Magazine, which was owned by Steve Jeppy. And in Baltimore Magazine, as like hey, welcome to Baltimore. We didn't actually live in Baltimore. We lived right outside. And in that magazine was an ad for the Diamond International Galleries, which were just opening. I don't know if you
Okay.
remember. Yeah, you probably do. You were
Yeah.
around as long as, and so Steve had bought Overstreet Publishing, and he had moved the Overstreet Publishing Group up to Timonium, Maryland, which is where Diamond was based at the time. And he was also opening this gallery. And I didn't know all this at the time, but I called that gallery because I wanted to see it. Like I was like, oh, this is cool. I'd found a local comic shop. I think it was called Alternate Worlds in Cockeysville. So I found a comic shop. I don't know what I was doing for money, but found a comic shop, called this gallery, and the person who answered, and again, one of the nicest people, I think her name was Anne. She said, "Well, the gallery's not really a public thing." I didn't know what it was. She says, "No, it's a public thing. It's not open yet." She said, but if you're interested in what we're doing here, they just brought all the Overstreet people up, and I knew the price guide. I knew the Overstreet price guide. Everyone, I think
You
knows
worked
the
in a comic
Overstreet
shop.
price.
You couldn't
You're right,
not know
exactly,
the
exactly.
Overstreet price guide. Yeah.
We just brought the Overstreet people up, and they're looking for people. They're hiring. They need to staff up. So she gave me a contact info of Carol Overstreet, Bob's wife, who was running the office. And I called and went in for an interview. And I was hired as a price guide editor originally.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
crazy. Was it? Do you
I know.
have a background? I mean, other than working in a
No,
comic shop.
I knew comics, all of the people there, and Bob was a super interesting guy, and still is. But was, he came up in fandom, right? And I wouldn't say I came up in fandom, but I came up knowing what comic books are and knowing the business of selling comics and, the idea of collectibles and all that stuff. So I was put in that position. I didn't stay in that position the entirety of the time I was there because I kind of transitioned over to writing for the magazine that they had started. And they started that magazine as a competitor to Wizard, ran it for about 2 years, but then of course Wizard won that battle. Wizard won that battle because that was also during the time, I think it was about 95. Correct
Okay.
me if I'm wrong on that. 95, when distribution, funnily enough, went to shit, right?
It sure did.
Marvel pulled out, the distributor wars started. Overstreet's Fan, which was the magazine that was put out by Gemstone, was a victim of that because Wizard was more important to Diamond as a business interest than his own magazine, which made a lot of sense.
Right.
Wizard sold 20 times what we sold.
Sure.
We gave it a valiant run.
Hey-o.
In those days, as a competitor to Wizard. And did the marketplace really need two magazines? I don't know. I mean, we had, that was a great job too, because I interviewed Alan Moore, I interviewed Grant Morrison, I interviewed Jeff Loeb, I interviewed, and those were good, interesting times. There was a lot of interesting comics being done in those days.
Sure. 100%.
Um,
That was, especially those late 90s. There was some really
yeah,
wonderful stuff that was being done. Almost like, now that there's no money in it, it's just the people who are really passionate about it, right? Relative to today,
yeah,
they had plenty of money, but still.
yeah. Yeah, and also, when you talk about, I mean, there was a time when this industry, and I think there was maybe Combo was around and Hero Illustrated had been around for a bit. There was a time when this industry supported, 2 to 3 print publications, about comics, comics and other stuff, But Wizard ultimately, and I ended up meeting the Wizard people. Fred Pierce is one of the, wonderful man. Got to know Gareb and his brother, and actually ended up working for Wizard briefly. But it was that Gemstone, those Gemstone years, and then of course they pulled the plug on that. I was laid off and then rehired, and then got a job offer to go work for a catalog company that was at the time known as American Entertainment, and you would see their ads in all the comics. They were kind of like what Chuck did with Mile High. They would sell back issues and
Right.
print ads in the comics. And this was in the very early days of the internet, and they were transitioning to an online presence.
Okay.
And that was a company that Steve Milo ran. They became anotheruniverse.com when I was there, and I worked there for a good long while, and that's how I got to know Nick. And then, of course, when, there were some other places in between, very short stops. The internet days, the online commerce days, as a friend once described, a lot of buzzwords and bullshit in those days, right? Um, but it was, it was during all that time where, there was just a lot going on. The internet was very
Sure.
new. People were selling comics online, toys online, all sorts of stuff. So again, when I really came to know Nick and go work for Dynamic Forces, it wasn't as a creative person, it was as a business person,
Because
you
you
know.
understood the online sales
Yeah,
aspect of this.
yeah. Which
I want to
which again wasn't rocket science.
let's dig into that, but before we do, and I have an ulterior reason that I'm happy to share with you later. Let's go back to Wizard Magazine specifically. You said you worked a little bit for them. Obviously, you were a competitor for them. Can you just answer maybe in a sort of encapsulated way? Why was Wizard Magazine important during that period?
Oh, well, Wizard made careers, Wizard made stores a lot of money by, again, I worked for, Overstreet was considered the Bible of comic book pricing, but Wizard
Right.
really came in, and one of the jobs that Fan was there to do was to update the idea of comics as collectibles, the newer market stuff, the Golden Age stuff, Silver Age stuff. They were all pretty much on the same page, and it's a very different market from today. I mean, prices back then were high, but not nearly what they are now.
True.
But when I worked in a store, we would use Overstreet for the old stuff and Wizard for the new stuff, because Wizard had a better grasp on, at the time, a better grasp on what the new books were doing, and that was the days of the pure speculator market. That was the I was in the store. I was working in a comic book store, the day Superman 75 came out, Death of
Oh,
Superman.
sure.
I
Okay.
was working in a store when Image launched. I was working in a store when Valiant launched for the first time.
Yep.
So, and all that stuff carried with it a tremendous amount of speculator interest and also consumer interest, reader interest.
Yeah.
All those early Valiant books were good. They just, they became a commodity, just like everything does, right?
True.
And Wizard was the place where you could see, like, okay, what's hot now, who's hot now, and what is the market setting. It's before eBay, right? Now online auction sites, and I guess I don't do eBay, but excuse me, I guess the market is set by the current conditions, right?
Sure.
Rather than a price guide, I know the Overstreet price guide still exists, but I don't know how it fits in the grand scheme of things with selling in today's world. So
I think it's more the people I know who use it just use it as a reference book,
sure,
right? How do you tell the difference between old classics illustrated other than
right,
what was in the Overstreet?
right.
So yeah, I can definitely see that. Well, thank
But
you,
Wizard
thank you for that.
Wizard was instrumental in so much of that era, for good and ill. I mean, I cast no judgment on them for what they were doing. It was entertaining,
Sure.
and again, they made careers. They for sure made careers.
They did sell the idea of comics. That's what when I look
Yeah,
back on all those Wizard magazines, they're like selling the culture of comics almost more than anything else. And
yeah.
then digging into what they can sell personally, whatever Stephen Shamus can push through
Right.
eBay, early eBay at the time.
And again, if you look, there's if you look at the legacy companies, and I would say Diamond Comics is one, Wizard is one, but if you look at, obviously Marvel and DC, but if you look at the talent that, business talent, talent that came out of Wizard, there's a lot of guys that worked for Wizard that went on to work for DC, that worked for
Truly.
Marvel. There's a lot of people that worked for Diamond that run companies now. I worked for Diamond. Philip Sablick worked for Diamond.
Yep.
There's a lot of there was a lot of stepping stones that I don't think really exist anymore. Unfortunately, that kind of put people into different positions in the business that gave them, Diamond was, and I've told this to Steve, um, probably for the last time, because he doesn't, Diamond doesn't exist anymore in that sense. But he's instrumental. He's instrumental in me being, where I'm at. I mean, I learned a lot I learned a lot about the business at Diamond, and there were a lot
Sure.
of people at Diamond to learn from. Not just the people around us at the magazine, but we had interactions with all of the management people that ran Diamond. Shanus and Roger Fletcher and all those people. So it was really instrumental, at least for me, to see just how big this thing was. Going from, I knew how big
Sure.
it was working in a comic book store because I knew the scope, but you're also in a microcosm at that point. You're in
Yeah.
a small little retail suburban environment. Maybe you go to I'd never been to a convention bigger than the Wizard World Chicago, which was at the time a huge convention. But I'd never
Yeah.
been, until I moved. I'd never been to San Diego. I'd never been to the New York shows. So seeing the size and the scope of all of it was really something that I had not had experience with until then.
It does take a moment too for you to go from I have these preconceptions of what comics is or what the industry of comics is, and I'm the local expert. So when people ask me, they assume I'm right, and then kind of opening
Right.
ideas, your mind to that. Well, so let's talk about, so it's around, we're talking about early 2000s when you meet up. What is your meet cute with Nick Barucci? What does that look like?
So I had gone from another universe to, they, again, they were bought by a VC, by venture capitalists, to turn that company into, the online destination for all things, geek and nerd and everything. And of
Sure.
course, I don't think that lasted, but I got a job offer from the Sci-Fi Channel to do the same thing I was doing in another universe for sci-fi.com. And sci-fi.com was being positioned to spin off into it. Again, this is the early, so this is 99 2000. This is when business people were seeing, well, we can spin off our IP, our corporate brands into their own .com entities, and they could be
Right.
their own businesses. So I went to work for sci-fi.com, and it was a vice president title. It was a move to New Jersey from where I lived in Virginia. My wife and I lived in Virginia. And it was classic. It was one of the greatest. They paid to move me. They paid the closing costs on my house. They did. I mean, it was like, it was
Oh,
amazing.
you made
Like,
it.
yeah, I know. Haven't had that since. Um, but I went to work for them, and that that was an interesting experience, but I got out before that collapsed, because it eventually collapsed, because the
Yeah.
.com thing collapsed. But it was during that time that I met Nick. I was aware of Nick when I worked for another universe.com, but I think that another universe and what Nick was doing were semi competitive. I think Steve and Nick were saw themselves as rivals in a sense, for going after the same kind of market, collectible comics and stuff.
Right.
Um, both guys that started their own businesses, right? You're going to have, you've worked for people that have,
Of course. Yeah.
you're going to have some headbutting and some rivalry and stuff. And it was all, didn't mean anything to me, but that's how I got to know Nick. And when I worked for sci-fi.com, they own the home shopping network. And I actually took a trip down to, I forget where they were in Florida. They were somewhere in Florida. I think they actually, funnily enough, they got absorbed by QVC, which is up here where I live in Westchester, Pennsylvania. But I went down when Nick was doing a show to see what the operation was down there, because one of the things I was tasked with when I went to work for Sci-Fi was integrating some of their back end systems into how can we sell more stuff online to more people? How can we sell more
Right.
collectibles? And they had an infrastructure down there, home shopping, really pre-internet, right? Like moving goods all over the world. So I got to know Nick that way. And Nick is always looking for, pieces to put into his business. There's been a lot of people that have worked other places, and I guess it's not a unique thing, but he's always kept relationships. Again, it's about relationships. He's always kept relationships open, so that when someone's available, he can say, "Hey, do you want to come do this for me here? And that was the opportunity that I got. And I'm very thankful for it, because again, and also September 11th happened, it was like, it was a very, first daughter was born. It was a very, very chaotic period. 2001 was a very chaotic period of time,
It truly, truly was. It's
so
almost, it's really difficult to communicate how everything just seemed like it was up in the air during that
yeah.
period, you know?
And like I said, I was, I don't have I was there that day. We lived close enough to see the smoke. I mean, it was like, it
Whoa.
was, it was chaos, and, I mean, you've spent time. Yeah. I don't know where
Sure.
you were on, but
Well, I was in
it was chaos.
California.
Okay.
I was in California, and I owned a comic book shop at the time.
Right.
And I remember Les going, "Do we open today? What do we
Right.
do?" And
Yeah.
then we ended up deciding to open just to give a place for people to
Sure.
go.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
like that was the public service we were able to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
But
totally
it
get
was
that.
it was it was after the events of that day that I realized, that that the job market collapsed to some extent in that area. So I took the opportunity that Nick offered and went to go work for him.
And how? I mean, so you met just because you were curious to see what kind of infrastructure they built, or like how did that come about? I feel like we missed that
I met
moment.
I met well I met and spent time with Nick because he was doing it, and he was also looking to do more because he was doing merchandise at the time. He was doing some licensed merchandise for some stuff that was on air at Sci-Fi. He was looking to me for an outlet to sell that stuff through sci-fi.com. So we just got to know each other through business opportunities.
I got you. Okay. I mean, of the relationships I can think of in this business, there are no two that seem inseparable other than you and Nick. I mean, more than you and Nick, because you are both that business. 24 years is nothing to sneeze at,
There's
right?
other people. There's other people, but yeah, I mean, and again, I think that also goes to the thing, the people that you don't see that aren't front facing. There's
Right.
Juan Collado
Yeah.
who's been there slightly less, but than I have, but also has been there for the duration of since we've been public. I mean, like I said, there's two timelines. There's the pre Dynamite and post Dynamite, right? And
Right.
obviously, post Dynamite is the time that I think in the history of the company that is the most vibrant and successful. Not that he wasn't vibrant and successful before, but it's the modern era. But a lot of the people that are there are not front facing people.
Right.
Everyone's content to let Nick to let Nick do that, except where he doesn't want to. So
That's very true. Well, so talk about, so you talked a little bit about how you transitioned into comics. Um, how did that I mean, you're now essentially executive editor. Am I getting that right?
I am
Editorial director. Am I getting that? No,
executive
executive editor.
editor.
Executive editor. Sorry, I'm looking at some older stuff.
That's okay.
Um, where how that transition? I mean, obviously you came from an editorial background, writing about
Mhm.
comics and interviewing people. What do those early days feel like? I mean, you were basically, being thrown into the deep end and working with creators, right?
Yeah, but when I look back, because I don't have, I don't have any specific memories of where things went wrong, right? And and I think, and this, sometimes when I say this sounds like kind of a cop out because I've spoken to people. I was a couple years ago. I was on a panel with in Ithaca with Mike Gold and Shelley Bond, right?
Yeah.
And Mike Gold, is a legend in the business, and Shelley is a legend. And also, when we talk about editing comics, doing comics, everyone has a very different background, and I always feel like kind of I guess it's imposter syndrome, right? Because
Sure.
here I am, 21 years ago, someone's like, "Hey, you want to do comics?" And like, sure, whereas people have trained for this kind of thing and spent their lives doing this kind of thing. But also, I guess some of the folks that came over from Wizard, Brian Cunningham, Mike Cotton, have a similar, they were in the comic world, and then all of a sudden they're at a company that makes comics. And like I said,
Right.
and I don't mean this belittlingly, but it's not rocket science. And the key to it, though, to make it as easy as that sounds, is hiring the right people. You know, when we started publishing, we were hiring writers that were already in the business. We were not breaking in new talent. We may have broken in new art talent, but we were not breaking in new writing talent. And I really think that's the key. It's a lot easier to break in art talent than it is to break in writing talent, I think.
Why is that?
Well, the mechanics of script writing, the mechanics of storytelling, that's something that I believe gets better the more you do it, and the more you do it successfully. I think breaking in art talent, if an artist has an innate ability, that's an easier thing to mold into putting 22 pages together than it is for a writer that does not have the innate ability to tell a story.
Right.
And I have never thought, because I don't think of myself as a creative person. Not to say I'm not creative, but I don't have aspirations to write comics. I don't have aspirations to draw comics. I have aspirations to tell other people how to write or draw comics. But I just think that if you're doing it and you've proven that you can do it elsewhere, there's nowhere that you can't do it, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So we were very fortunate, to just start that way. And also with the cover talent, we weren't breaking in new cover talent. We weren't breaking in anybody. Alex Ross was doing covers for us. Nobody needed to tell him what to do. Nobody needed to tell John Cassaday what to do. Nobody needed to tell J. Scott Campbell what to do. They already knew what to do.
Sure.
They just needed to know, what are we doing with this? And licensing, has a different set of challenges. I will say, I think that, overall, from what I know of people that work for Marvel or DC, there's challenges everywhere, but there are extra layers with licensing that make things a lot more challenging, because you're not just dealing with your own internal approvals and saying this meets all of our standards and this is what we want to do, but you're sending it to someone else to say, yes, you can do this with our IP. And we've been very fortunate that we have long-term relationships with, we're still publishing Army of Darkness, and that's 21 years later. We're still publishing
Amazing.
Red Sonja, and that's 20 years later. In the last 5+ years, we've entered into relationships with the two biggest, media companies on the planet, Warner Brothers and Disney, which presents, their own particular set of, here's how they do things. But licensing does make things more challenging. Whereas, like, when we publish Vampirella, we often, who's approving this? Well, we are. This doesn't go to anyone else. We don't have to send it out to anyone else. Or when we were doing our superhero stuff, that all was internal approvals. It's very night and day, not in a good or bad way, but it's very night and day from dealing with a third party that has the final say.
Right. Well, let's dig into that. So you guys, arguably, you're one of the experts, not arguably, you're absolutely one of the experts in dealing with licensed books and licensed comics, especially as many as you publish now. How many titles do you have on deck right as we speak?
We're right now, well, this year's not been a great example, just because there's been a lot of stop starts with the distribution stuff. But, I would say, we're averaging 10 to 20 titles, a month.
10 to 20 titles a month. That's
some months as few as 10, but we're always, things are always ebbing and flowing. Some things are ending, some things are starting.
Sure.
And I'd say probably about, I could pull up a spreadsheet and look and give you an exact number, but
no, it's good.
I don't think we need to get that surgical. But I'd say at least half or more than half are, well, I'd say 3/4 are licensed.
Okay. So 3/4 of those. Right. Okay. So let's talk about what it takes, because you're having to do a lot of, in your role, you're having to do a lot of hiring and firing and bringing in and making sure team
very
team
little
dynamics.
firing. I've been very fortunate. I have not had to do very little firing.
I have seen that. And I think that just goes to how well you hire. So let's start from the top down. What makes a good editor for a licensed book? Whether it's something that you guys are approving or something that say you have to work with Disney, like what does a good editor look like?
I think it's knowing what the parameters are before you start. It's knowing what the company's the third party company, the licensors expectations are, as a licensee.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a learning curve with Disney, a little bit of a learning curve with Warner Brothers. Nothing dramatic and nothing, catastrophic, but just, Disney is such a large company and encompasses so many different things, um, and has so many different entities within itself
Right.
that there are a lot of boxes that and a lot of people that look at things, right? So it's being able to navigate that, but we have partners on their side that help us navigate that. They have an editorial team that helps us navigate that. So it's really just knowing what the expectations are, and also not doing stupid shit with their characters. I think that's the unspoken thing, is just don't do something. Don't try to do something stupid, and then don't do something stupid if we're not paying attention.
Right.
Because their IP is more important in the long term than
Then
their relationship or their business that they get from us. Their IP is everything. And that goes big and small. We work with there's one guy that owns Red Sonja, right? Like, as opposed to Disney, which is this or Warner Brothers, which are these
right.
massive companies. And we've had a few situations like that where it's like it's one being that controls this IP, and that is a very different relationship, and sometimes a more flexible relationship, sometimes not. But more often than not, it's more flexible relationship than a company that's publicly traded, and there's so many other levels that they have to be concerned with, that you really have to treat it like almost as like a they're doing you a favor even though it's business, they're doing you a favor by letting you do this, because if you mess it up, it's got ramifications that mean very little to you as as the publisher, but could mean
Sure.
so much more to them as a big company.
So they have a lot of risk, right? Is
Yes,
what you're saying. Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
So there's a lot of trust that needs to be earned, I think, with your counterparts on the other side. And we've been very fortunate that we've got good people working for us, Matt, Nate, Marshall, and our production people, our marketing people. We've got good people working for us that understand that, because that's all we've ever done.
Yeah.
With the exception of a few things, but that's all we've ever done is be responsible for someone else's intellectual property.
I definitely see that. Having worked with Nate Cosby on a separate project, I definitely see how that responsibility holds through. But I did want it to not, before we lose it, I want to make sure that I don't lose the Joe Rybandt secret to licensed books, which is don't do stupid shit. That's a
Yeah.
that's a it's right there, kids. It's in the rule book now.
And I will say, that it's, a lot of people might think, like creative people might think, oh, it's restrictive.
Sure.
I don't get to do what I want. And no, you'll find in life often you don't get to do what you want, right? But I am also always, as long as it's not stupid shit, I am also always championing the creative end if there is any pushback. Less so with like Disney or Warner Brothers, and we don't have, just because I know that no one on the other end is looking for anyone. No one's looking for pushback, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is the box. Please play within these walls, right? And these walls can be super wide or they can be super restrictive. But when it's come to other things where we have maybe a smaller company, smaller IP, and trying to do something a little different, and creative wants to do this or wants to do that, or there's a note that we get, you know, I'll go back to when we were doing the Lone Ranger. Um, we got a note about the bad guy in that, who was a particularly nastily written bad guy, right? Very, very Deadwoody, although I think this was before Deadwood. And we got a note like, oh, he can't do that. And I said, well, he's the bad guy. I mean, like
Yeah.
that's the point.
He's not the hero.
So
Yeah.
so it's about pushing for the things that make sense, to allow the creativity and the storytelling to go in the direction that needs to go in. And sometimes you win those fights, sometimes you don't. I've had a handful of those and probably won half and probably lost half,
Sure.
but for the most part, I think, with a lot of, we've been very fortunate again over the last 20 plus years that we've had really good partners that have allowed us to do things. And again, it's also not going to them and doing and trying to do something stupid.
All right. So if that's edit, we've covered editors. What do you when you're looking to because you cast a lot of writers, and you're talking about how they are the important piece because if their experience can kind of carry you through. What when you're looking at a new writer, what sort of characteristics are you looking for?
Well, I guess it's defined new.
A new
You
for
know,
you, right? Because you're saying you
yeah,
want to work with experienced people, and that makes a
yeah,
lot of sense.
previous work, standing in the marketplace. I don't look at social media, so I probably should. Um, I assume that if I haven't seen a headline involving a creative person that's coming to me looking for work, if I haven't seen a negative headline, because I do follow,
Yeah.
I don't get into the weeds, but I do
Right.
follow. And if you've put yourself into that spot where you've generated something stupid,
Yeah.
that's a problem, because again, if we're looking at IP and other people's IP, they don't want any part of any of that, and they could
Sure.
be super innocuous, but no one's looking for, that the old expression, there's no such thing as bad press. That is absolutely untrue in the year 2025, and it's probably been untrue for the last, what, 10 years,
Easily. Yeah.
if not maybe realistically a little longer. um so I'm looking for published creatives, and if you're looking to get onto, because a lot of what we do is licensed, that if you have some experience with licensed books, I will say, there are flip sides to that, and I'll give Nick credit, because Nick discovered, and I don't remember what it was through, but David Pepose,
Right.
who had not worked, as far as I know. I think he was doing stuff at Marvel, which was not licensed, but and also came from a background of working, I think, for Newsarama and being a reporter and et cetera, et cetera. Um, but Nick was like, let's try this guy for Space Ghost, and it was like a godsend. He's total professional. He's a great writer. Knows his shit. You know, can hit deadlines.
100%. Right.
I've gotten to know some people in this business that have been around for a long time, and in conversations with those people, the private bar conversations, it's, don't make my life difficult. I'm 54 years old. I'm not looking for anyone to make my life difficult. I can make my own life difficult, or I
Thank you.
can, or Nick can make my life difficult, or the a licensor can make my life difficult. I do not want the creative end of things to make my life difficult. And the biggest thing that makes things difficult is not being able to hit a deadline.
Truly. Truly, truly. Yeah, I definitely see that. And you start to, that doesn't, when you have somebody who misses a deadline, that memory never goes away. That's once you
Yeah,
put your hand on that stove, you don't have to worry about ever
there's
remembering.
there can be forgiveness. There can be
Sure.
forgiveness. There are, you know, we're all human beings, right?
Right.
And we're all living life. And I do not, I do not have a lot of close personal relationships with the people that work for us. I have some. I've developed some just through, time,
Longevity. Yeah.
working with people for a certain length of time. Um, I'm also very particular, and so, not always looking for new friends, so to speak. But so I don't always know, and I don't always want to know. I know that sounds callous,
Sure.
but I don't always want to know. I just, it because the I, my heartstrings are difficult to tug on. Um, but they can be tugged on if there's something going on. So
Sure.
there can be explanations for all of this stuff, but we have to have a relationship that I can understand what it is and why these things happen. And I've been very fortunate again that I have not had that happen. I think there's been a handful, literally, and less than a handful of creatives, whether it's a colorist or a letterer, or very few letterers, or an artist, more everyone else in the process has blown deadlines and gotten
Sure.
on that. Sorry, we can't.
Yeah.
You're great. You do great work, but you know, and you've worked in publishing. Once you ship issue one, in 30 days, you're shipping issue two.
That's right. That's right.
And then, so
The hardest
it's
decision you make is where do you place what backlog do we have before we solicit issue one,
right.
right? That's, I
And
mean,
we're
once you do
very,
that, it's on the
and,
train is on the
and,
tracks. Yeah.
and we have always been, I tend to backlog more stuff because, again, I'm looking to make things easier in that sense. But as a smaller publisher in general, we're pretty much going when we solicit,
Yeah.
so that train has already left the station and we make it work. Um, but and I think a lot of people are doing that. I think the days of going and pulling something out of my drawer to throw into issue 7 of Gargoyles doesn't exist. A fill in,
Right. You're not
those
doing
days,
fill-in work, right?
right? You don't
Yeah.
have inventory stories, for good or
Well,
for ill.
well, talk about why that is, because I mean, it seems obvious to me, but again, trying to be conscious of the audience. I mean, that's a budgetary thing, right?
Well, yeah, you're putting out the cash, and also in general, I use Gargoyles as an example, but in general, Gargoyles is driven by the creator. It's driven by Greg Weisman. So why would you, first of all, he's a total professional, so you're not going to be in the position where he's going to miss a script or whatever.
Right.
Or if you are going to need to take a skip month, in advance, so you're already planning for it, and you're skipping a solicitation to catch back up for whatever reason. But we're not in the days where you can just throw a random story in the middle of an existing story arc.
Nobody will ever notice. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a very different. I was actually just reading a more recent Fantastic Four collection that was put out around the. It's Franklin Richards, one of the Marvel Epic collections, and it's like the stories are all over the place. There's 4 Byrne stories, and then forcing. It's like, because they were just juggling their overall schedule. There's also some gaps and stuff, and they were putting things together in a theme. But you look at it, and it's very uncohesive in a sense. And I think if you look back at what we consider kind of the glory days, like there's a lot of, except for with a few exceptions, when a run was going for an epic length, like Claremont Byrne or Byrne on his own with Fantastic Four, or Lee, Kirby, whatever. There's very few things that are like speed bumps in there where it's like, oh, they just had to throw this in because they didn't have an issue that month. It's just a very different time.
It also, I think, at the time, the idea that, I mean, unless people were subscribing and having it sent to their home,
right,
the chances of you knowing that an audience is going to show up at that newsstand every month is actually pretty slim compared to the number of people who are buying it. So they didn't need to, right? They didn't have to keep that in mind. So yeah, I could definitely see that.
My mother had did not take a positive view of comics for whatever reason. I can't ask her. She is long deceased, but I read other stuff, so I was never really, and I was also young, so I never really thought like why, except I was just an authority figure telling me. But it was like once a month, and when you go to in those days before I found a comic shop, when you went and you spun that rack and you were super into the X-Men and there wasn't an X-Men there and you can only buy one comic, well, I guess I'm buying a random Spider-Man, and then you know what? If that's a to be continued, I have no idea where that went. And we're not in those days anymore. I think in a good way. There was something fun about that. And it's also, as an adult, I can go back and I can see, okay, that's where that went. That I missed at the time. But we're not in those days anymore. So.
Well, we've covered editors, we've covered writers. But you've already talked about like what makes a good artist. But one of the relationships that I think it gets under discussed and is in the headlines now, if you're watching our industry, is the relationship of editorial with agents. I know that from conversations we've had on the show, Davide from Studio Arancia, and I know that he works with you guys a lot. Can you talk about what that relationship is like between an editor and an agent like that? Because so much of your talent is coming internationally, and where that strength is.
Yeah, I think for the most part that is key. The key part for me in that is communication. Um, because you're dealing with non-English speaking, you know, other side of the world, whole different day night configuration,
Right.
um, so whenever I've worked with an agent, is imperative that that agent be absolutely on top of what's going on, because otherwise I have no idea. I because I'm not in touch with the artist. I'm trying to think. I don't work. I personally, on the books that I run, I work directly with all the talent. Nate works a lot with studios, and he makes that work. Not to say I have worked with studios in the past,
Right.
and the key has always been a good agent. There's always been someone that does it. And over over the 20 plus years, there's been a couple that aren't, around anymore, that, like, they're not doing the job. They're not providing what I need, which is, again, they're making things difficult for me, and I'm chasing an agent. I should never be chasing an agent.
Right.
The agent should be chasing the talent, and the agent should be telling me that this is all here. And if there's a problem, I just need to know. I think a lot of things that manifest themselves into people losing jobs or whatever is just simply trying to hide, the fact that things aren't things something's wrong.
Right.
And it's like, I can deal with something being wrong. I mean, I'm not going to get mad, I'm not going to be happy about it, but I can deal with something that's going wrong. I just need to know.
Yeah.
If I don't know, there's nothing I can do. And that's the agent's job, is to know what's right, what's working, and what's not.
100%, 100%. Like, humanity is real for all of us, right? We're
Yeah.
all dealing with it on a moment to moment basis. But yeah, just being able to communicate that. Also, I would say that so much of my career, maybe you can agree with this, so much of my career has been about kind of learning to translate. Like, for me, at first it was, how do I translate for a retailer what publishing needs? And then once you get, I mean, I realized that editors, their primary job is to translate to the creators what the company needs, and back and forth, right? You've had sort of this sort of background that allows you to kind of see the whole board, right? You're speaking all of those languages. Where do you think that comics can, I mean, aside from the communication that you're referring to, what do you see as like the stumbling block for comics, just as an industry for growth, leaving aside the marketing and advertising of it all?
Well, it's interesting, because I think I first met you via Comics Pro, right?
I think
I
so, yeah.
think I think you when you were I don't know if you were doing retail, you probably were.
I think so, yeah. I
Um,
was a retailer
doing
when we met. I remember
Yeah,
that very clearly, yeah.
and in the early days of Comics Pro, or when Diamond would do summits, you would see very few people like me there. You would not see a lot of editorial people.
Right.
Now, in some cases, with Diamond Summits, they were attached to a convention I was going to anyway, or whatever. But I was at that very first Comics Pro, and I did our presentation, because I think Nick did not make it out that year. I think it was the first. I don't know if it was the first. It was one of the very early ones. It was out in Las Vegas.
Sure.
Because we're a small company, and because I do look at all aspects of the business, not just the creative aspect. I think it's important to have direct communication with our retail partners and our distribution partners, and in addition to everyone else that we interact with. And I think that over time, other companies and other people figure that out, because if you look at who is going to Comics Pro, not so much Diamond Summits anymore, obviously,
Right.
but Comics Pro, you see a lot more creatives there.
Sure
You
do.
see, Tony Fleeks was there, David, with this last one, in Glendale,
Yeah,
last
that's right,
two in
yeah.
Glendale, and one, depends on the location and all that. Same with the last two before that in Pittsburgh. You saw a lot more people coming that were either independent creators that had an image book, or even had a Marvel book. Chip Zdarsky was in Glendale, and as obviously understands also by doing his newsletter and all that, obviously understands that putting yourself in front of the retailer goes a long way to, one, understanding what you may be doing wrong as either a creator or a publisher. For us, it's we do too many covers. And two, just the face time. You're
Sure.
with people, that are making that extra effort to go leave their store, spend their own money, either travel across country or travel some distance to learn and to communicate. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, it's a
okay.
good answer
but,
anyway.
yeah, but that's why I do those things.
Sure.
And it's to see what's going on. We have people that do that. We have Vince Laterio that does that, and Alan that does that. But I think again, being part of the business side of thinking things, it's important. It's not a big ask. We're a very small industry in the grand scheme of things.
Very
It's
true.
not hard. It's not hard to get in front of people. Whether it's through organized events like that, or whether it's just through regular communication. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't talk to him every week. I don't talk to him necessarily every month, but my best friend runs a store in Madison, and it's always good to check in with him. And he happens to run a store that's part of one of the largest chains in the country. I know Nick is good friends with
Sure.
the guys at Midtown, and checks in with them. And hey, what's going on? Is there something we should know? Is there someone we should know? Is there and just like, how is this book doing, and all those things. So having that one-on-one is great. You can have that one-on-one with everyone, but an organization like Comics Pro or whatever, I think actually Comics Pro is actually going to prove itself to be even more important now that there's a multitude of distributors, because I don't
Yeah.
know what disposition for any one of them is going to be to do their own thing. And I don't know that they need to do their own thing, just my opinion, when you have an organization like Comics Pro that does it. So I think you've seen more people, more creatives and editorial people figure that out as well.
I think so too. Well, you invoked it, so I'm gonna bring it up. I actually, on my list of questions is, how many is too many? Let's talk about covers, because you guys have been on the kind of vanguard of that. And I want to tell a story to set this story up. For one of my first jobs after leaving retail was working with Top Cow, and I went to go work for Philip Sablick, and we were talking about variant covers, and he said there seems to be a blip. Comics just does this where we find something and then we'll run it into the ground. I doubt it'll last very long. And that was what, 2010, I think it was, right? So obviously it wasn't just a blip, but you have, I mean, you guys don't do, you don't do shitty covers, right? You do amazing work, but you do a lot of them, and have always been very aggressive in that. Can you talk about what is the incentive for that, and where is the line? At what point do you feel like you've crossed it?
My personal belief is, and this is not the corporate stance,
All right.
is that personal. No
I
one's
can't
forcing it. No one's forcing anyone to buy anything, right?
shoot.
Personally, I'm okay with a couple of options. Do I need 4 or 5 options? Personally, no, I don't. But what we have seen in the entirety of our publishing experience is that when we reduce the number of covers, we reduce our sales.
Yeah.
And, you know, believe me, it would be a lot easier, to chase 2 artists for a cover than 4. And
Sure.
just logistically, we don't
Yeah.
have, it's the editor's responsibility to pull in all the cover art. We don't have, I don't know if Marvel and DC have specific cover people. I know back in the day, things were a little bit more segmented. But, it's my job to find, 4 to 5 cover artists, that can deliver every month,
Yeah.
because we don't drop that number. Now, when you take those 4 to 5 covers and then you drill down and create, you use the word incentive, not meaning this, but now meaning this,
Sure.
that's for retailers to mitigate their risk, right? Does that work? I do not know. That's not my. Well, that's not my. I mean, that's not my thing to know.
Right.
That's Vince's. That's not the. That's Vince's problem, and that's Nick's problem, and that's Alan's problem. It doesn't work.
Right.
Like when you have a total of 25 SKUs for an issue one, is that working? I know that more often than not, we hear you do too much.
Sure.
And I think though that we have brought that back under but when I'm working on the Harley Quinn Elvira book that we're doing, and there's going to be a lot of SKUs. there are there's 5 main covers, and there's going to be a lot of SKUs. There's going to be a lot of
Yeah.
variations. There's going to be a lot of incentives, and then we also do retail covers,
Right.
which is its own thing. That's not hurting anybody. The retail covers. Now, to the end consumer, we used to have a guy, and this is way back when, but we used to have a guy, and I know, I'm pretty sure all stores have still at least. There used to be one guy came and bought one of everything. Did
Yeah,
you
I
ever have a
had one
guy?
of those guys.
Right.
I still
Everyone
remember
had
his
one,
name.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Bought one of everything. Everything. And then you have people, and again, I don't follow the aftermarket. Nick does. Nick follows the aftermarket. So believe me, because there's a cost involved in producing those covers. Not just commissioning 5 main covers, but there's a cost involved in printing, plate changes,
Yeah.
and producing variations of those covers.
Well,
If those covers were not bearing out in the overall, we wouldn't be doing them.
I mean, and the opportunity cost, right? The people that you have doing that could be doing something else to grow the company.
Right.
I think there is a very strong argument to be made of, I hear you retailers saying there are too many. The reason there are not too many is we keep making them.
Right.
We keep making them because they sell.
And I realize that it to a retailer that does not like that business model, for me to say nobody's forcing you to buy them probably raises hackles. I don't mean it as confrontationally,
Right,
because I know that they still have to look at an order form that's got all these SKUs. I
yeah,
know that. But if they can't sell those, then don't order those.
right.
If everything is a line item, and then the incentives are based on if you order 25, you're going to get this. You want to get it and throw it away, get it and throw it away. You want to get it and give it to a really good customer, get it and give it to a really good customer. You want to get it and try and flip it on eBay because it's particularly hot, the artist is hot or whatever. I think you'll also find that when there's a market trend of either a style or a theme or an artist, Mark Spears comes to mind most recently.
Yeah,
that variations of that work, they can be monetized. They can be monetized in the very near term.
right.
Are they monetized in the overall? I don't know. Only time and crystal balls will tell you whether or not they can be monetized long term. But in the near term, in the short term, they can be monetized.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, we had the golden age, we had the silver age. We seem to be in the Mark Spears age. So we're all just working for him in one form or another. Let's talk about. I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk about. We talked about invoked retailers, and in many ways, Dynamite was kind of built around the direct market system. A lot of that. That the industry has changed, right? It has shifted quite a bit. And there are now multiple venues that comics are being sold through. I will say Nick is famous for having sold comics on QVC back in the day, and has been on that vanguard of many other venues, including crowdfunding. I know that you do a lot of book market work. I know that there are some digital platforms. Can you talk about, does any of this shift the editorial viewpoint on a project? Does it change the editorial viewpoint on a project?
Yes.
How so?
No elaboration.
Moving on.
Yeah, the mass market, and pursuing business opportunities with companies like Scholastic or ReaderLink via their channels can add exponential volume to a project if the project has the legs for such a venue. Most recently, we did a graphic novel adaptation of the first Pumpkin Queen novel. Disney did Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. Disney did a Pumpkin Queen novel. It was very successful, New York Times bestseller. We did a graphic novel adaptation of that novel. We're doing another one as well, of because there's been a second novel. That is a mass market opportunity.
Right.
Um, we're doing some stuff with the character Stitch. That's a mass market opportunity. So it shifts the editorial focus in terms of, well, what are we going to expand upon? Where are the properties from whatever rights holder or license? Where are the properties that we can expand to not only perform well in the comics market because they're recognizable, but also perform in the larger markets, the mass markets, the book fairs, and then the what remains of bookstores, and then what remains of mass market sellers, which would be your Targets and your WalMarts and stuff like
Right.
that. But conversely, like The Boys has been our best selling trade, you know, for the last one of the best selling trades for the last however long that show's been on. It was a great seller before that, and then the show happens, and boom, new season of the show comes out, and it's like the heart rate spike. There's all orders increase to bring in copies through all channels. So yeah, it just is it's identifying those. It's not every property. It's identifying the ones that are going to have the wider reach. And usually, and that's one of the upsides that comes with working with licensed stuff. We have it with Warner Brothers as well. We're doing a Wizard of Oz thing, and the Thundercats has potential to go larger than just direct market. There's also some category expansion there that goes larger than direct market. But you are right, though, and Nick has always been a big believer in this. And I think it's not a hard and fast rule, but I think it's more a hard and fast rule than it's not. That it has to work first in the comics market. If it doesn't have any existence outside of like, there's a few exceptions where we've done just product for the mass market, whether it's adaptations or whatever
Right.
of existing IP or literary IP or whatever. But things in the comics market generate those trade sales, which then get to potentially larger venues. You know, so
Let's. I would be foolish. You mentioned them. I would be foolish not to spend a little bit of time talking about The Boys. So famously, The Boys starts off as a Wildstorm book, and then leaves DC, and Dynamite picks it up, and you guys take it on. This is pretty early in the cycle. I mean, most of The
it was like
Boys was doing
2004, 2005. Yeah.
right, right. Um, you are like I'm sure very involved in that period. How do is there a lot of editorial back and forth when you have Garth Ennis and as a Derek Robertson working on something like that? Do they just have their lead? You just let them run? Like, what is that from an editorial standpoint? Where are you working?
My role in working with Garth is facilitating production of the book. There were a handful of things that I may have mentioned, and I don't even think they were like notes. It was more just thoughts. A few things that I thought were going to get us in a lot more trouble than ended up getting us in trouble at all. When we were producing the book, a few things I was like, well, timing on this couldn't be worse.
Can you give
Let's
an
all just be
example?
no,
Okay.
just because they didn't happen, and I don't want them to happen. That
Fair.
book was chock full of like, what the fuck moments,
Yeah.
by design.
It was daring you to be offended, right? It
Yes.
was
Well, I don't think that was Garth's intention, but yeah, I mean, you could absolutely look at that book and be like, if same with a lot of his work. And his key is he doesn't do social media, so if it happens, he doesn't care. In the sense
Can't
that, you're not going to
cancel me
run
all
him
you
off.
want. I'll never know.
You're not going to run him off of Twitter because he's not on there. But it was about facilitating, production of the book, making sure that everyone was working on a schedule that kept things flowing, and more just making sure the logistics of colors and letters and getting the final vision done was done. Like I said, that was a creator-owned book.
Sure.
So, you know, I'm not the creator. Who am I to go in and tell Garth Ennis, who's, or anyone that's doing something creator owned, as long as we've agreed that this is your thing, that, we don't do a lot of creator owned, obviously.
Right.
And that was a unique situation, but that book was, I wasn't editing story content. That was all, that was all Garth, art was all Derek and then Russ. And, it was a self-made machine. It was just making sure that machine happened every month.
Yeah. You're more the mechanic, right?
Yeah.
Than you are. Yeah.
And I'm
If it
fine with
was.
that. As we did Garth wrote a James Bond thing for us. And it's the same thing, like my job there was to make sure that the things he wanted to do with James Bond would be okay with the Fleming estate.
Yeah.
And that they wouldn't get into the weeds on some choices he was making, because he was making those choices for a reason that he thought would resonate with the audience. And he was right. So my job there was, again, not to give him notes, but to prevent him from getting notes, in a sense.
Right. Having the conversation beforehand rather than
Yeah.
having to dial it back.
Yeah. And we did that, when we've done that with when people of a certain stature come on, they're not looking for their lives to be made any more difficult.
Right.
They don't need to write licensed. Certain creators don't need to write. They don't need to work for anyone. They can do whatever they want for themselves, right?
Yeah.
And there's certain people that have reached that stature. So, the quickest way to lose someone with a big name or a stature is to all of a sudden drown them in a bunch of, like, don't do this, don't do that. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And if you have the conversation before, and the Flemings were super receptive to it, as long as, and again, Garth wasn't going to do anything stupid. He's a professional. It's the same thing. That rule, now that I think about it, that rule, that's a pretty good rule to, is this stupid? Why am I doing it?
I'm
Is
getting
someone
you a
going to
plaque. I'm getting you a plaque. Don't do stupid shit. That's it.
don't do stupid shit, and if that going in, that that you can again, it's that level of trust. These people have brought a certain level to the business, to the profession, and they're, let them do what they do. There's a reason that they're here.
100%. All right, so I wanted to talk briefly, and I know that there's in many ways this is a dynamic issue that your company is dealing with. You have been kind of at the center of this Diamond bankruptcy and the conversation about it and its ramifications for the comics market. So I don't want to get you into any trouble. So feel free to let me know if I step over a bound.
Sure.
But I'd love to talk, because I feel like you have a unique viewpoint since your career started at Diamond, and you've been involved with Diamond now for 3 decades or so.
Yeah, the entire Nick's relationship goes back, from the start, from him starting to solicit comic to the direct market. Yeah.
Yeah. You have a unique view on this. You mentioned working with Bill Shanis and Roger Fletcher and obviously Steve Jeppy. Let's talk about what went wrong, right? I think that's everybody I talk to has a different viewpoint, and in many ways we're all blind men describing the elephant, right? But I'm really curious to hear from you with where you guys are and the ramifications of how it has affected you. What are the lessons this has taught you about a company like that?
Well, and again, I don't know where the market was at when you were doing retail, but when I was working in a store, I think we dealt with 3 distributors. You know,
That's when I started. Yeah, we were working
yeah,
with a number of distributors. Yeah,
you know, when I was working in a store, you started there was a regional distributor, and then if you did enough volume, you could get up to another. You know, there was Capital, and then Diamond and Capital were we were with Friendly Franks, and I'm
sure.
sure there was probably some other sub distributors and stuff. So in one sense, none of this is earth shattering changes, right? I mean, it's earth shattering changes in the fact that the market is obviously much much smaller than it was back in those days, for sure.
Sure.
So I totally understand, and again, in talking to my retail friend, I totally understand the pain in the ass that is dealing with, you know, three distributors or whatever it is. Well, yeah, it's three distributors
Yeah.
right now. And I know that logistically, internally, there's a lot of work that needs to be done with data to feed this machine.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lot easier when it was one place, right?
You filled out a
So,
form, you gave it to your brand manager, he filled out the metadata, he thought about it, right?
right. So, our relationship with Diamond was a good relationship. It was a positive relationship, I think, for a long time with both companies. And that relationship was maximized with our relationship with Diamond Books. We
Mm-hmm.
had Diamond Comics, we had Diamond Books, and those things all kind of fed into each other. And a lot of it also was Nick's relationships with the various people that were, we had, I think we had all the brand managers, because of the length of time that we were there. And there were other publishers that had that same relationship, but us being very direct market focused, as you aptly pointed out, this shift sucks in
Yeah.
that sense because, one, it sucks the way it went down. It sucked. The fallout sucks. The all the legal issues suck. And this is just this is just my perspective, and it's but really when I think about it, and we've been we're in August now, and we've been going through this now for the majority of this year.
Right.
It's caused untold stress on the systems and getting books out. We've gone weeks without. We're back. Things are back to normal now, but there was a long period of time where things weren't coming out. There's cash flow issues. There's all this stuff. There's also the ease at which it was being done. When
Right.
you're giving your solicits every month to one place, rinse, repeat. You're putting books out, rinse, repeat. Now everything's brand new. Um, I want to think that it's a positive in the big picture. That because it has worked itself, with the exception of the legal stuff that's going on, which is
Sure.
being resolved now. For to what end, I have no idea, and it'll be up to the bankruptcy court and the judge and all that. Our books are coming back out. We have a good partner with Lunar. I think we're distributing a little bit through Universal, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm wrong about that, it's only because I think they're open to everyone. We have a great book partner now in Simon and Schuster, which personally I think is a big step up for us. From no offense to Diamond Books, again, personally, but Simon and Schuster, like that's big time, right?
Yeah. 100%.
So I think that in terms of opportunities that's going to afford us, that's a big positive. And again, nothing against Diamond Books. That whole relationship worked very, very well
Right.
in terms of, our relationship with Diamond Comics and Diamond Books and all that. But once that imploded, then I got to look at it and go, okay, well, this is better.
Right.
This will be better for us long term. And it, for a small company, and also the strain it puts on creators, if we have to slow payments, if we have to, because we kept everything kept rolling. Books were still being produced. I was still working. Everyone was still working. But you don't know where it's all going to go. You don't know where it's all going to shake out. So, just in terms of stress, I mean, it's been a very stressful year in that front.
Yeah, no kidding.
And
I can only imagine.
yeah, and this is not unique to me. This is not unique to Dynamite, but we've been in the thick of it, I think, a little bit more. Um, Ebb and flow. So how it happened, why it happened, you know, I don't want to speculate. I mean, I just think I think it's easy to blame COVID, but I think you I think
You
you
just
could blame
you
COVID.
got to blame COVID.
um, I think that I'm not a Monday morning quarterback,
Sure.
so I don't say, well, they should have done this, they should have done that. But COVID fucked a lot of stuff up, and that's a duh statement, but it really set the course for where we are now, and it was 5 years ago. And it was like a slow motion collapse. And then with us, it's a terrible divorce. I've never been divorced, but it's a terrible. I've seen movies. It's a
They suck.
yeah,
Oh,
it's
the
oh,
movies
and
undersell it how much they
right.
suck.
So I mean, I think this is like a divorce, right?
Sure.
There's lawyers involved, and there's courts, and there's fighting, and there's, you're not getting this and you're not getting that, and it's just really unfortunate, because I think for a long time, what a lot of people didn't understand about Diamond was that once the market got as small as it got, to keep all that going was a real effort. There's not a lot of money in moving $4 and $5 periodicals around the
Yeah.
country. It's pennies on the dollar, right?
Yeah.
So for a long time before all of this, when people would complain about Diamond, I always thought, well, you don't know what you're talking about. No,
Yeah.
I'm not talking about retailers complaining, but at some point, the fan interaction with the business became too familiar to me.
Yeah.
You know,
I
and
get that. Yeah.
you've got message boards talking about diamonds, like, well, diamond should, well, you don't understand how it works,
Yeah.
and you shouldn't have to, but why are fans and consumers talking about distribution?
Why are you postulating about this? When you
You
have no
know,
stake in it.
and
Yeah.
then it just becomes this, well, they're a monopoly, they're a monopoly, they became a monopoly, you know for very particular reasons. The market couldn't support multiple distributors,
Right.
during that time. The market now has to support multiple distributors, or there's not going to be as many publishers,
Right.
because PRH isn't going to, they're all going to do their own thing at this point. There isn't one repository anymore. So, um, it's not a great outcome, but it's a workable outcome, I think.
Yeah.
And I will also say that during all of this, we did not see, I think it was the last month, we did see a real hit on previews orders, but at that point, it was when all this was going on. I think it was the last catalog that actually anyone turned orders in for. And retailers
And
had
that was the
gotten out.
first one you saw a hit on.
Yeah, yeah,
Really
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah.
I would
And
not have
then
thought that.
FOC would still kind of level out. I don't think it,
Yeah.
by that point, though, that hit, we were already in the process of things were going to be changing.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether that hit would have been realigned with FOC or not.
Sure.
But by the time that hit, every retailers were not ordering from Diamond. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
by that
Yeah.
last one,
Oh,
everybody, we were
they
the
were.
last man standing on that front.
Well, yeah. They were too busy to bother. So you've now done 3 decades in comics. You have as editorially, you have as strong a viewpoint as anybody. You've done enough business development at this point, been behind the scenes. If you are a young publisher heading in, let's say Nick says, you know what, I'm done. Yeah, go with God. Go build something else, and you're forced to kind of start from scratch in comics. Where what are you looking at as far as where's the undiscovered country, or what is that? What would the shifts be if you were just beginning that process?
Well, I think it's format. I think that the market and the business over my lifetime has done some remarkable things with format. In terms of you know both experimentation and then also just an adaptation. And I say this when I talk to younger talent, and I see that I see that they're, well, I'm talking myself out of a job, but I see that they're not going to ever draw Spider-Man or the Thundercats, right? They've got a very esoteric style. They're doing their own thing. And I go, you can do your own thing. You don't need
Yeah,
you don't need me. You don't. What you need a publisher for is to propel you into the marketplace, to do the things that are too much to do yourself. If you're starting out, but the avenues, if you're starting out, to get your work out there are limitless at this point. I mean,
truly.
certainly over the time that we've been around 20 years, I mean, that's changed. You don't need anyone. You can do everything yourself. The question is what is your goal? Is your goal to just, do everything yourself? Do you want to, for some people it gets to be too much. That's the Image Comics model, right? You do a lot of, but Image also offers you some infrastructure that a publisher does. So in terms of where things are at, I don't like the term boutique publishing, but I think refining and focusing and creating brands based on a few more select things, for me personally, would be a lot more manageable, than the disparate, things that we've done over the last 20 years, because there's not like one thing. It's always been, you mentioned some at the beginning, but I mean, nothing naturally goes together, with the exception, even within Disney and Warner Brothers, there's a lot of disparate IP that doesn't
Sure.
interact with each other. It's because of the nature of their companies. So I think a refinement and a focus would be something that I personally would see a lot, could see a lot more of in the future. And then as part of that, the format. I think that, I personally do not do a lot of, all my reading is done digitally these days, so I'm not a print guy anymore. I still buy comics, but and I still buy some books. But if I'm reading digitally. But I think that that's just me personally, because I just
Right.
don't want. You can see I've got too much stuff as it is, of a lifetime in this world. Um, but I think that the treating books and treating art and treating comics as art objects, much like the vinyl resurgence did, where it's creating this object that you've got to have. And I see that with my kids. I have a
Right.
24 and a 17-year-old. Like objects are more. For some reason, my youngest daughter's buying cassettes and CDs. Right?
Isn't that crazy?
I know.
Physical
I, I'm
media.
I'm
Why?
like, if I never, and forget about vinyl. Forget
Right.
about vinyl, which I always found to be the most difficult of all ways to enjoy music. The fact that everything is on my phone to listen to, I could not be happier. So, but the younger generations, and I think this is a positive. I'm talking about my personal versus
Sure.
where I think business is. The idea that people still want objects, I think, is great.
100%. I think it's
And I don't think
wonderful.
that's going away.
Yeah, it's great for us because we
Yeah,
sell shit. But
right.
like the idea of, I guess I understand vinyl, right? You can say there's a certain
Sure,
distance and I understand, again, like maybe a little bit the printed color is a little bit
sure.
different than color
Yeah.
with light coming through it. But man, I do not understand the cassette tape. Why are you people coming after cassette tapes? They were horrible. They were a
Well, I
stopover.
will say, I will say, I always, I personally purchased cassettes. I didn't buy records,
Yeah,
because I always had a cassette deck in my car.
sure. But it was
So,
convenience.
right, yes.
It wasn't
And
quality.
then once CDs were around, I stopped buying tapes and I bought CDs. And then once
Exactly.
digital was around, I stopped buying all of it. Right, Um, and vinyl's got it's the purity of sound. I get that. I'm not arguing that with you,
Sure,
but
sure, sure.
the
Yeah.
idea of a record, to me, playing a record is, and I know people like this about it, but it is always such a. And if I want to listen to it anywhere but at home, I got to put it onto a cassette to put it into my car. So
Yeah. Um, it was we were just starting. I was making some jokes about you being surly and no nonsense.
I don't
Uh,
think you said Surly, but you can add that one.
I'll add surly then. In that case, when what excites you? Like, what's next? What are the things that you're looking forward to that on the horizon for what you are doing personally and what Dynamite is doing?
Well, I'm fortunate that I don't really get to pick and choose what I work on, but I get to pick and choose more than most because we have, I have people. There's other people that work for the company that I can say take this or do this, and
Right.
some people naturally have a better feel for the material. Again, I am one to fully put myself uh, and say this. I understand the mechanics of how we could do this, but I can't do this property justice.
Right.
It's either out of my demo, it's out of my it's not nothing's out of my comfort zone, but you know when we there's a lot of stuff there's a and I can't get into specifics, but there's a lot of properties that we go after that I go, I don't even know what that is. I mean, I know what, I don't know what it is. I don't know what we do with it, but I recognize that it's a good opportunity. So
I'll figure it
then
out. Yeah.
or I'll find someone to figure it out,
Yeah.
you
Right.
know, and usually that involves someone younger, I
Yeah.
mean, and let's just be honest. It usually involves someone younger. I do try to keep up with the world around me and in both a political and entertain, all the stuff, but it's
Sure.
exhausting. I mean, it's a
It
full-time
is.
job in and of itself, um and there's so much entertainment out there. There's so much pop culture is culture now, right? So
100%.
it's very difficult to stay on top of all of it unless you just want to consume it and not think critically on it, right? And in my spare time, I like to watch things that I enjoy. I don't want to feel like my job never ends. And if you're just consuming things all the time for to be on top of it, then that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Your job never ends. Um, so exciting. We're always doing something new. There is always, our relationship with Warner Brothers has expanded to include new properties. Our relationship with Disney is expanding to include new properties. As I mentioned, there are some things that are out there, um, you know, and also historically, like when we got the Shadow, I was a huge fan of the Shadow, so that was great.
That was
That
easy.
was something I looked forward to.
Yeah.
Um, when we do stuff with John Carter, I was a big fan of those books when I was a kid, so I naturally like that. That's old man stuff, right?
That's
So
mine. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But Space Ghost was one where like I watched that show when it was in reruns in the 70s, and I always liked the design. I wasn't a huge fan of it, but
Right.
working on it and seeing what David's done with it has given me a new appreciation for like what can be done with some of these things that really weren't meant to be anything other than 15 minutes of entertainment. There's no, I was having this discussion with we're doing a Blue Falcon series, right? And you go, oh, Blue Falcon. And Dynamite, right? Oh, and but I was having, and Jimmy Palmiotti's writing. I was having this conversation with
Yeah.
him, and it's like he looked at it, and I looked at it that way too. There's no backstory, so it's all his.
Yeah.
There was that cartoon, great design, goofy dog, right? Fun, great when you're 8. But some of this stuff you can put a lot of other things into and make something brand new. And I would say I don't know that we've announced it. There's it might have been announced, but and I'm not trying to do a fake tease, but there is something with that I'm editing that's a addition to our Warner Brothers license, not a Warner Brothers property, but something that they own through past acquisition with a writer I've never worked with, whose work I really really like. So stuff like that happens all the time.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff that is perfunctory. This thing is just its thing. I have no particular attachment to it. um no, Red Sonja, coming out of, and I've worked on almost every Red Sonja thing that we've done for the length of the last 20 plus years. But coming out of San Diego this year, being outskirts of the cast and the panel and the signings and the movie release and all that. It's exciting, you know.
Yeah.
I watched the movie. It was entertaining. I liked it. Watched it with my wife and eldest daughter, and I think my youngest one will watch it at some point. I point that way because she's in the room back there. But and so coming out of that and what they've done with Red Sonja, and then thinking, okay, so we're going to do a new book next year, and that gives it a new, that gets me creatively thinking, okay, what are we going to do with a new series? Because
Yeah.
now more people have been exposed to it than were before that movie came out. Whatever that movie does, more people are going to know Red Sonja than knew it before that
Before.
movie. So that's something that I can look to and think, okay, that's an interesting challenge to make work.
That sort of cooperative storytelling. That's something that is it's so comics, right? It is like you're in many ways, we're just stewards of many of
Yeah,
these ideas over and over again that we're just yes-anding the people who came before us or are side by side with. I think it's a
right.
fascinating piece of what you're working on. Well, that's excellent. Well, we've been going at this for a while. Is there anything particular you wanted to talk about that we haven't covered?
No.
Good.
I'll ask you, what do you do when you run out of insiders?
Oh man, there's always new insiders. Are you kidding me?
Okay.
I've got a short list of my kind of grail interviews. I'm going to chipping away at those, but I will say that the comics has become so complicated that there's always somebody who I can learn from, and that's really what this whole thing has been about. I mean, we've never charged for any of this. This has all been for me.
Right.
So there's always somebody out there who knows more than I do about something. So,
Hopefully, I found this to be very, very entertaining. I love talking to peers about stuff like this,
yeah.
and you've certainly been a great conversationalist
Oh,
in that
thank you.
sense. I do not watch a lot of comic book podcast type stuff. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah,
but
I've
I think that this probably hope, and so my long way around is saying I hope it's entertaining for the people on the other end that are going to sit there for 2 hours. Man, are you going to do two parts, or are you going to just force everyone to do one part?
we do it as one, and a lot of people, I will say, the YouTube analytics say that like first, I would say the majority of people dip at around 20 minutes.
Okay.
But like a big portion of them stay all the way through, and the
Yeah,
podcast analytics show that like people just listen to the whole thing. They love long form conversation. I
I
mean,
love long. That was one of the and maybe they still do it. But one of the things I really enjoyed when I was reading the Comics Journal and also listening to stuff like Fresh Air, or even when I was listening to Mark Maron's podcast back in
yeah.
the day, the long form interviews I think are the best if you like the subject.
I mean, you're talking about being that period where I was working in a comic shop and reading the Comics Journal, and you read these like 20-30 page
Yeah,
epic Gary Groth gets into the
yeah,
weeds with somebody. Like, that's the
yeah. If you're
shit,
interested
man.
in who he's talking to or who he was talking and the
Yeah.
subject, I mean, that's the best. It's the best.
100%. 100%.
You going to
Well,
get Alex Cox on here?
I keep trying. I want him on. He and I talk on a regular basis, and every now and then I go, "Is it time yet?" And he goes, "No."
Yeah. Maybe I have to imagine he will be surprised that I did this. So maybe this will be a turning point for him.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. Alex, I hope you're listening, buddy. I'm looking forward to it eventually.
Well,
All right.
he's I know he's a good friend of yours. He's become a good friend of mine, and he's another guy that's had just a
Oh
fascinating
yeah.
again start from retail, into where he's been,
Comics Journal. I mean, Comics
yeah,
Journal.
CBLF,
CBLDF,
yeah,
IDW. Now at Image. I mean,
yeah,
he's definitely and written some stuff for you.
yes, he's
Yeah.
a great writer. He's a really great
Is
writer.
he? Yeah.
Yeah,
I've read a couple issues. So yeah, that's good.
yeah,
See,
no,
I'm
he's good.
poking at him, hoping he'll come on and give me shit about it.
Yeah.
Joe, thank you so much for doing
No,
this.
thank you.
And let Nikki know that when you talk to him, I'm ready for him. So
I will.
whenever he's ready.
I
Awesome.
will. All right.
All right. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for listening to the full hour and 49 minutes that Joe and I have been talking. We really appreciate it. And please do like, subscribe, and as Nikki would tell me, hit the alert button. He reminds us of that one of that every time we do a live show. Awesome. Thank you again. We'll talk soon. Namaste, y'all.